Hello, Isaac.
Hello, Rabbi. Good morning.
Okay, good. Good to start again. So, we're very excited. We're getting towards the end of the Beatitudes, right? Get into this heart of the sermon, and we're actually getting to the first Beatitude, which a lot of people, some people will note that it's not really part of the Beatitudes, or it's really an addition. And it's really interesting that just like life, everyone knows when the Beatitudes start, but no one knows when it finishes. So it's not somewhat unclear. So. This one, I think most people will say that it's part of, but let's jump right into the 10th verse and see what we make of it.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Right. So great verse. What's interesting about this is a lot of the pieces already exist, right? We already know things are blessed. We know we're talking about people. We already know righteousness is mentioned. And while persecuted is first mentioned here, we know that in the next verse we have persecuted again. So yeah.
In terms of word righteousness, is this used in the same sense as in the same in the same sense as 5:6,
You tell me,
or
Isaac.
does it mean a different kind of righteousness? Because the word righteousness has different levels of meaning.
Yeah, 100%. So what to analyze this, I think the starting point would be to take note, as you're saying, that this is a second mention of righteousness. But I think it's also, we get this idea that we throw out a kind of noun or verb, and then we stick like an adjective or adverb on it. So for example, we have in 5:3, we have poor, and then we know in spirit. And then we also see specifically in, as you mentioned, 5:6, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So I
Mhm.
think what's interesting about those two verses is that they exist independent of the extra clause equally. We'd be just as happy, specifically in the first one in 5:3. We know Luke actually doesn't have the clause, but over here I think we can make the same case at least. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Period. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Versus those who are persecuted for the righteousness' sake. So even before we try to figure out what righteousness is in comparison maybe to 5:6, the question is, I think a bigger question is, does it change the meaning at all? If you get persecuted for righteousness, or you get persecuted, if you imagine the kingdom of heaven, however it is, Isaac, would you imagine that Jesus cares about why you're getting persecuted? If you're getting persecuted, like if you're getting persecuted because you're a jerk, maybe that would be like, oh my God, everyone hates me. But I feel like when we read this, we would have assumed without the word for righteousness, the person's getting persecuted for the religion.
So then let's define what's meant by persecution, right? Is persecution like does opposition have to meet a certain threshold to qualify as persecution? Or
Yeah. Again, persecution is one of those words that we could definitely define legally, but I think it's one of those things that you know it when you see it, right? It's very very clear to you, and it could be what's different about persecution than maybe a full out frontal attack is that one might feel persecuted who is not really persecuted,
Mhm.
um, but when you see someone else being persecuted, you know what it looks like. Also, persecution also shows up that sometimes a person might be persecuted. Like for example, when we look at the inquisitors in medieval Christianity, so they were obviously persecutors, but they were what they would call persecutors for righteousness. They were only torturing the people who specifically were not part of the faith. So they would be able to analyze this phrase, as long as I am a persecutor for righteousness, that's fine. So I think like when we talk about persecution, it's definitely a wide array of ideas. But I think if you look at it in the context of the Beatitudes, I think it definitely has a further context, because what we keep seeing, until peacemakers at least, is that we're seeing downtrodden, the people that are on the lower either economic or the lower spiritual, or some, if we imagine a gradations, a span of ideas of what it means to be religious or to have a standard religious background, a lot of the Beatitudes are definitely advocating for the people who are not for the more standard background. So I think if you look at persecuted from that perspective, I guess in the context of the Beatitudes, that it definitely represents a different kind of idea in the range. So when you look at, poor in spirit, mourn, meek, hunger, thirst, all those, as we noted, all those are not really things that you do. You're hungry, you're thirsty, or you're poor in spirit. And we noted that not until you get to 5:9 do you have someone who's a peacemaker, someone who is actively involved in the beatitude. And I think what we have over here is also someone who is, I don't know if the right word is actively involved, but someone who's experiencing something very concrete, right?
So in this case, somebody who is the object of somebody else's of what hatred or persecution or along those lines. So
100%. There's definitely some form of, at a minimal, unilateral relationship of someone doing something, speaking to someone. What we see, though, when you look at Matthew, most of the persecution that takes place is verbally, and most of the persecution that we see historically, when we view a persecution, we don't generally view as sticks and stones may break your bones, the model of persecution, even though that's what that is meant to teach. A lot of times, persecution for the Christians, especially once you get to when Matthew would have been written, would have been different than the persecution that Christians experienced when Jesus was alive. It's a very, very different kind of persecution. They were getting tortured and maimed and absolutely ripped apart by the time you get to Matthew.
So when verse 5:10 was said, when Jesus mentioned this, the audience would need a framework to understand this. So what would they? So they'll probably understand this in the context of things which happened before or things which were said in the Old Testament, right? Because at that point they didn't know what the future might play out. So how do you think they would have understood this verse? So let me.
Well, I don't personally look at the temple. I a lot of times bring up the temple would have been in the immediate memory of the Matthean community, the temple's destruction. And we know of all the Gospels, the Matthean community probably would have had the closest connection to the temple and with Roman persecution. But I don't think we have to look at Roman persecution for Jews when we look at this as much as Roman persecution of Christians. I think this is one of the first things that opens up. It's hard to say Jesus would have said that, but the Matthean community, I think, very easily would have felt the idea of persecution and that they're not allowed to believe this or that they are a fifth pillar in their countries. So I think that the idea here is like the rest of the Beatitudes, because you feel persecuted, because you have this attitude that you're not really on the regular team of the normal people, of the regular people that experience religion, therefore you're going to have a unique attitude towards the kingdom of heaven, which will give you a lot more like a golden ticket to get into it much more easily.
So could you expand on this unique attitude? So it's not the fact they're persecuted. You're saying because they're persecuted, they acquire this unique attitude.
Well, I
And
think that's true
because,
about all the attitudes, right? I think that's yeah.
So in the context of this, right, what unique attitude does say those who are persecuted, like what does persecution give, or what unique attitude does persecution give a person? Or does a person acquire by being persecuted?
100%, that's a good question. And I think psychologically, it's interesting to understand all the Beatitudes. But I think like when you look at poor in spirit, what's the unique attitude that gives? I think the attitude is it means that you're not regularly part of the standard spiritual system that other people would have access to. I think when someone's persecuted, it just means very simply that you don't have it. The religion is not coming easy to you. You're not easily, it's not normal for you to be able to access. A lot of times people who are persecuted will specifically feel that regular society is anathema from them. They aren't part of regular society. And the regular norms of customs or laws don't apply to them, not because they don't want it to, it's just they can't. When you look at the way that religion formed in India, specifically, that there were the way they broke down into different groups in the early centuries of Hindu culture, you see that there was certain people who were inherently persecuted, but they didn't have time to kind of be the religious folk. They didn't have the attitudes to see things in a philosophical or ideological or metaphysical framework. And the fact is that the priestly caste would have had those attitudes, kind of broke them into two groups. So I think when we view Indian culture definitely could give us like this precedent where people don't have this ability to kind of see the ideological because they're so persecuted, so they didn't get the attitudes that the other ones would have had. And I think one of the things that Jesus keeps being critical of is the standard attitudes towards Judaism. I think the Pharisees and the crowds and the Sadducees represent the norm. And he wants to say, like, I want to keep some of it, but the fact that you've already been adulterated by these frameworks of thought is inherently negative. And I think persecuted people will identify with the other. And if anything, Jesus more identifies with the other.
Okay, so in this case, who's been persecuted? The Pharisees not being persecuted. The people are not being persecuted. So when he said this thing, like, who in this context, when he was preaching the Sermon on the Mount, who is the one who's being
So,
persecuted?
the options are 100% the Pharisees have been persecuted, obviously.
Not at
Obviously,
that time. Not at that time when this was said. What do you
not in
mean?
what year are we talking about?
Well, like, well,
When you say not in that time, what do you mean?
okay, okay. Let
No, I would just say, for example, in Jesus' time, the Pharisees would have felt that they were being persecuted by the Sadducees. They had thought they had been in this internal battle. In the
mhm.
years 50 to 80, or 50 to 70, then the Jewish people have been felt that they've been persecuted by Rome. 70 to 120 to 125, there's another revolt that there's such persecution when this is written in Judea, at least, that there's another massacre revolt. But I have no problem saying that this is specifically referring to Christians, that Christians would have felt persecuted by Romans and by their society. But I think even once you take it out of its historical context, from a beatitude context, it has inherent meaning that the persecuted is the other. And Jesus, if anything, is trying to, I feel like when you look at a charismatic leader, this is actually like somewhat a funny concept. There's a charismatic leader that attracts the cool people. The cool people are the ones who are doing right, but they want to kind of like, they want to wear the fancy clothes. They want to get the nice cars, and they want to kind of stay cool. But then there's like the not cool people. And those people always feel dejected. They always feel rejected. And I feel that they don't even have the same rubrics of thought as the cool people. They might want to, but they can't even imagine it. So I always imagine Jesus is kind of appealing, at least during Jesus' lifetime, to the less cool people, to the people who are already rejected in society. And don't forget, there's such economic diversity in Judea and in Syria at this time, that there are people who are like living on great, like wheat, like pieces of wheat. The people who are living on like one piece of carob tree wheat. These people have nothing. They forget about religion. They're only focused on how to survive one more day. And they would have felt the economic destabilizing elements of having the really important landowner at the top versus them. So I think you could have religious persecution, but I think it would have been an underlying element of their society to feel persecuted.
So in terms of the distinction between Matthew, between 5:3, blessed are the poor, for their kingdom of heaven, to blessed are those who are persecuted, right, for their kingdom of heaven. So in terms of distinction between these both, the one was we noticed was Luke had a focus on those who are economically poor. Matthew changed this to add, poor in spirit. The one here in 5:10, it's persecuted for righteousness sake. So what is the distinction? I mean, do you draw a line between those who are, poor in spirit, are being persecuted for righteousness sake? Because the end goal, the end promise is the same to both, as in theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
So
And
you're
so
noting a very important thing, right? Why is 5:10 lacking in originality? They're both the kingdom of heaven. Why is it repetitive? So, very famously, Saint Augustine, when he commented on this, he goes, "You think there's 8 beatitudes? You're wrong. 7 is." I read Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2. I see that God works in sevens. 7 is this magical number, and so if God is going to re-give some form of basic rules, or if Jesus is going to give his foundational speech, St. Augustine is saying, "I know Jesus," and you know what he would do? He would give
seven.
something. So the fact that we see the 8th is already not the Beatitudes. It's a new one. And number 2, he would be able to prove that. He's saying like all the Beatitudes are so foundational that they would never be repetitive. And
Yeah,
if you look
this,
at 8, and specifically if you look at 9 is so repetitive that people kind of feel like, sorry, the 9th one, which is verse 11, it's so
10.
repetitive that people are like, maybe this is a summary. I don't get it. But I just want to talk about maybe one of our last couple minutes on that idea. It's really interesting idea that of the 7 and 8 number that St. Augustine is trying to argue. It's one of the ideas that we see in Judaism all the time, that 7 is the idea of regular nature, what you would do, and 8 is restarting the cycle, or that which transcends outside of the normal world. So we have this idea that Rabbi the Maharal, Rabbi Lau, that he says that a circumcision takes place on the 8th day for males, specifically because it's that which takes place outside of nature. You're kind of taking nature you're given a orla. What I don't know English for orla. What the cover of your penis, whatever it's called. I don't know in English. Whatever it is, an orla. You're given an orla, and you say, "I'm not happy with the physical world. I'm gonna physically cut and change the physical world to show that I'm entering a spiritual world." And I think that what St. Augustine is trying to argue in this in the Beatitudes is really interesting. That you're doing the reverse. That the 7 first ones are representative of this kingdom of heaven, of this new spiritual world. And then once we get to 8, it's a repetition. I'm just telling you, we're back to like in the physical world, we start doing review, we start making sure that the normal standard practices are going. And that's why just the verses 5:10 and 5:11 for St. Augustine are back to the world. So I just thought it's really interesting how we see the reverse here of what you expect. The first 7 for St. Augustine are the spiritual world, the godly world, the way that God controls the world. And then once you get to 8, 9, 10, you're back to the physical world, which is, I think, somewhat the opposite of the way the Maharal, this 15th, 16th century rabbi, would see the world, that you have the first 7 days is the physical, and then you get to the spiritual. And I think, when you look at this, you have to question, why does it say kingdom of heaven again? Poor in spirit, I think, is very, very different than persecuted. A persecuted person could be what's opposite of poor, rich in spirit. A persecuted person, we really don't know anything about them because we don't know why they're being persecuted.
I think, to your point earlier, it's not being persecuted. It's about the attitudes his attitudes one obtains because of being persecuted. Just because they're persecuted does not mean they enter the kingdom of heaven. It's like by undergoing persecution, people acquire certain attitudes, and that is what takes them to the kingdom of heaven. So the question I would put forth to you is, we kind of poor in spirit is in some ways broader. We can broadly define poor in spirit. Is Jesus saying, by undergoing persecution, if you acquire this poverty in spirit, this poverty of helplessness, or this poverty of knowing how poor you are, is that what? So to your point earlier, this reinforces 9:3, right? This reinforces 9:3, or it says 9:3 in different ways through the language of persecution.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The language of persecution, it's a very complicated language, because you could say the Beatitudes, because of your attitude towards your persecuted state, you'll be able to get to the kingdom of heaven much more easily. Or you could say, because you experienced the persecution, you're able to get to the kingdom of heaven more easily. It could be the persecution changed you so much that now you're fitting to get into kingdom of heaven. Or on the other hand, like our former option, is that the persecution allowed you to think in a certain way. Didn't necessarily change you, but it gave your framework like a poor in spirit. And I think, persecution, again, is such a complicated topic. And the history of persecution of Jews, Christians, Buddhists, whoever, everyone getting persecuted, it's going to give if you don't use persecution for good, then there's a problem. Like we see when people are thrown into ovens, or if you look at the way that Haman persecuted the Jews in the story of Esther. If we look at the way that the Pharaoh persecuted the Israelites in Egypt, what we see is that persecution, at least from religious and theological perspective, is meant to be a jumping point for growth. And I think a lot of times we don't view at pain and suffering as a jumping point. There's this idea in Judaism called afflictions of love, that God wants to reward you in the next world, so he's going to rip off your legs in this world. So it's really interesting to see this idea that the persecuted have an easier road to redemption, or easier road to this kingdom of heaven. Again, we could probably talk about this much more, because obviously when you think about Christianity or Judaism, one of the most common topics you talk to, at least historically, is martyrdom. Martyrdom is the history of persecution. Okay, I think that's our note that you have on.
Yeah, Rabbi, on that note, thank you. Have a great day, and blessed are the persecuted for their kingdom of heaven. Have a great day. Thanks, Rabbi.